So I just wanted to start with a couple of discussion points, which I hope we'll pick up on, after the presentations. Because for me, any talk about social media and its place as in this sort of nexus between activism and reporting has to begin with an assessment of what's wrong with the conventional mainstream media model and what holes have been left gaping by traditional forms of journalism. And then we can begin to interrogate the question of whether social media can offer something different. Now, prior to the Egyptian revolution, which began in January, I'd been based in Egypt for 3 years. And I saw with my own eyes, as many people in this room would have seen as well, just how skewed a lot of the mainstream media narratives were when it came to covering the country. And this was partly as a result of Mubarak's strategic alliance with Western governments, partly because of the sort of inherent flaws in the corporate mechanics of the mainstream international media. Some of the stuff that Robert and Richard were talking about earlier. If anyone hasn't read Nick Davies' brilliant book, Flat Earth News, in which he talks about journalism, then go out and buy it straight away, because it fantastically explains kind of some of the things I'm referring to. And the result was that, international consumers of news, be they newspaper readers or television viewers, were left with a distinctly inaccurate picture of what was happening in the country. And that, in turn, helped promulgate this endlessly repeated mantra that political upheaval came out of nowhere and was completely unexpected, which always rang hollow for those on the ground. And the kind of things I'm talking about are, this tale of Egypt being an economic success story under Mubarak, 7% GDP growth rates, this wonderful liberalizing government. All the while, 9 out of 10 people in the country got poorer in real terms. The number of people living in absolute poverty doubled. The number of children who were malnourished rose. And yet those kind of figures were never discussed in the mainstream media, nor were some of the key drivers behind political change, like the trade union movement, working class activism in factories and textile mills and workplaces around the country, rather than seeing a division between social movements on the ground and the regime. The international media always seemed a lot keener to focus on sectarian tensions or on the division between religious thought and secular elites. Subtly, Mubarak's prism was being repackaged and reinforced through the international media, which had fairly toxic consequences. And that brings us to the role of social media. The debate about what exactly social media's contribution was to mobilizing dissent is an endless and, quite frankly, sometimes quite dull one. I'm sure we'll cover it in a bit of detail, but this kind of black and white dichotomy between either, social media had nothing to do with anything, which is patently ridiculous, or the other end of the spectrum with all the kind of pictures of the single guy who held up a "Thank you Facebook" placard in Tahrir Square, and every newspaper in the world reprinted it about 1 million times. That also seems rather off the mark. I think that social media, like anything else, is a tool of communication, and like all tools of communication, it can be turned into a tool of mobilization. Either by revolutionaries or by regime elites. There's a great and also quite sad story in Sudan. In Khartoum, a Facebook event was started trying to bring protesters down onto the street in opposition to Bashir, and a few dozen turned up, and they were promptly all arrested by security agents, and the whole thing had been planted on there by security agents in the first place. So the idea that it's a one-way tool to bring down unpopular regimes is off the mark. I think, massive political upheaval has always been accompanied, alongside many other factors, by an imbalance between political opponents on the one hand and regimes on the other in terms of their capacity to utilize new forms of technology. And we saw that in the Russian Revolution, using the telegraph. We saw that in 1989 with the fax machine, and we're seeing it now with social media. So, are these things the cause of political change? Of course not on their own, but do they still play an important role? Yes. I think what's more interesting and perhaps more pertinent to our discussion is what opportunities social media offers to provide something different in terms of media coverage. I mean, when we're talking about these mainstream media narratives being inaccurate and having, devastating consequences, we can ask ourselves, well, what can social media do to challenge that? Now, social media may be the preserve, in Egypt at least, of a relatively educated, urbanized, in some cases English-speaking and westernized elite, but that still brings a whole new range of voices to the table. And people can take to Twitter, they can take to Facebook, they can take to other forms of social media and challenge some of these inaccurate narratives that I've been talking about. The problem is that they can also reinforce misleading narratives. And I think one of the things we're seeing at the moment is a focus on Egypt's revolution being the product of a certain subset of youth activists, which completely takes things like the trade union movement, things like working class organization, other social forces like the Bedouins in Egypt, or certain groups like the Coptic Christians or the Nubians in the south, people who aren't so readily identified with social media, it takes them out of the equation. So there are pluses and minuses, and I think the important thing is not to see it as some kind of all-encompassing route to media salvation, but rather as an added tool that can be treated with caution as an incredibly useful way to expand the range of narratives and to challenge misleading conceptions and to open up the debate. The other danger, and I do want to mention it quickly, is of a slightly Orientalist discourse, which I've seen cropping up again and again in the international media, which implies that the political upheavals we've seen in the Arab world this year involve some kind of emancipation from, the backwardness of old political models and an embrace of Western ideals and of Western technology and an advancement to a new level of sophistication. And in that respect, Facebook and Twitter are often held up as examples of that. I mean, we could talk all day about why that narrative is flawed, but the use of Facebook and Twitter and the identification of them as Western technologies, however inaccurate that may or may not be, definitely kind of gives rise to that danger. So, to sum up, I don't think social media on its own is a problem or a solution. I think it has great potential, and I mean, the question is, for me, more, what are the structural problems with mainstream media on the whole, and how can social media be used to plug some of those holes and improve what we do? And hopefully that will be a starting point for discussion, and if I can stay awake, it's a discussion I'm looking forward to having. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack.